Thank you, Jason. You've traversed quite some ground and presented very complex issues succinctly and accessibly for all of us. I'm sure there may be many questions, so we've got a little bit of time now. If there are questions from the floor, please unmute yourself, and here's the opportunity to ask Jason those questions.
We'll remove the slide, Janet. Thanks.
There had been quite a running commentary in the chat box throughout your presentation, Jason, so it's really interesting of not only affirming some of the points, but sharing resources as well. So, Francis, here's a question from Francis.
Oh, hi. Thank you for that. I just want to ask, the ACT doesn't have an HSC. Does your research, if you've done any, indicate that ACT students are better at self-directed learning? And the other is an observation, which is AI in education can't ignore the threat of AI after education, that it must be very demotivating for students to face the prospect that what they want to study will be an activity done by robots.
Yeah. Oh God, that second one's huge. I'll start with the first one. So the ACT is a kind of counterpoint to the way that's working in the other states and territory. We don't have systemic data yet, but that certainly seems to be, based on what I've seen in the conversations I've had with colleagues in the Department of Education for the ACT, yes, that does seem to be something that is helping students to be better at self-direction. But we need to do more work there. The interesting challenge we face at the moment is that the ACT is unsure about whether or not they have the best conditions, given that they don't do external exams, and they're worried about students might be able to do all of their senior secondary via AI and not actually learn anything. So there's a very interesting tension going on there. In terms of the jobs being replaced by AI, that I think is a continually moving feast. And it's so interesting because it's so different across discipline areas. So, I mean, IT is an obvious one where things are changing really rapidly, and, you know, these large language models can produce code all day long. But there are some others like architecture, which I think are already being fundamentally impacted. Whereas, you know, the other side of the equation is areas like physiotherapy, where I'm not quite sure that I'm comfortable with a robot physiotherapist just yet. Maybe not my thing. If you're into it, good for you. So I think it's a really good point that we need to, the onus is on us to work with our industry partners to make sure that what we're doing is preparing our students for a world where, you know, they can work with and alongside AI to do the jobs that they want to do. But that's a big question. Yeah, such a great point.
Great, thanks, Jason. Any further questions or even comments for Jason?
Hi, it's Marie speaking. Jason, you thank you for a great presentation. You talked about systematic change, but are there sort of dot points that the individual lecturer can do in their own small way to improve the student outcomes and address the dropout rates, etc.?
Thanks, Marie. Great question. I do a lot of teaching. I have about 300 students a semester. So I ask that question myself quite a lot. For me, I think that there are some relatively straightforward things that we can do that I've seen that make a big difference. I talk with my students about learning a lot because that's content for me. But even when I was teaching in areas that weren't about learning and teaching, I would still spend quite a lot of time up front talking about why I had developed the course the way that I had developed it, what it meant for students learning, what high quality learning looked like in that context, and then I would reinforce those messages on the way through. So spending the time up front to give students a sense of how I thought about their learning and what was important to me for them to learn, this sort of sometimes what we would call a hidden curriculum component to all of this, was something that I really wanted to surface for the students so that they understood why. The mistake that I made early in my career is that I just went, oh yeah, there's an outline of what this course is about, and that should just make sense to students, and we would just plow into it right from the beginning. I found such a difference when I would just say, stop and say, no, hold on a second. Let's talk about what learning is. Let's talk about why learning in this way is really important in this course. And let's think about how that then is going to impact on what you're going to do in future if you're interested in continuing in this area of organizational psychology or whatever it was that I was teaching. So kind of the front ending bit, but then reinforcing, we're doing this particular activity because it, the classic constructive alignment stuff. We're doing this particular activity because it's important for your assessment, and your assessment is going to help you for this other thing later on. The learning that we're going to do is going to allow you to develop this kind of skill and this knowledge, and therefore, so it was always just about pulling the pieces together. I think, yeah, I had this stuff in the back of my mind, but I didn't make it as explicit as possible. When I did, it was a dramatic difference. So that might seem fairly self-evident, but I think it's really important.
Great. Thank you, Jason. And we've got hands up from Amanda White and then followed by Jan.
Hey, Jason. Good
Hey,
to
Amanda.
see you again. We've seen a lot of each other recently. I love all of the different things that you've talked about in terms of how we can better support students in their learning and the learning experience. But the accountant in me says, this all costs money. Right, to give students more time with their tutor so they can build a better relationship, so that we can have trust. And, for me, trust is really important in that learning process. What are the arguments that we can use to try and free up more dollars for teaching and learning inside higher education institutions? What suggestions would you have?
Oof. I wish I knew the answer to that, Amanda. I think we all struggle with that a little bit. Having come from somewhere that was in a fair amount of financial difficulty, and I've worked for 8 universities, so pick one. It wasn't Melbourne. I think we look after students because it's the right thing to do, right? That's first and foremost. But there is a side effect of doing that, in that we can potentially retain students far longer than we might have otherwise. Now, of course, that's not why we do it, but retention is a big deal, and it does financially make a difference to the university's bottom line. So this institution that I was at before would do the calculations of, if we retain X number of students, then from first year through to graduation, then that accounts to X number of senior lecturers. Like, they would really get down to that fine level of granularity. And I think that there is something about that argument. But at the same time, that's not the primary reason why we do it. We do it because it's the right thing to do. Students make sacrifices to come and study with us. We should be doing everything within our power to help them achieve what they want to achieve. But that's how I make that argument.
Here, probably, the people who are here in this Zoom are the people who are going above and beyond, are spending more than the hours that they probably get paid to do any of this. But, the goodness of our heart only goes so far. It creates our mental health tolls on us individually. And so how do we push? I think that's, there's no, just like there's no unicorn assessment, we're all stuck in this same thing of how do we try and do more for these students with less. And there's been lots in the media about how we actually have more professional staff in higher education institutions in Australia than academic staff or people facing students. So big challenge. Thank you.
The other thing I would say, sorry, Melinda.
No, go, Jason.
The other thing I would say is that I think that there are really smart ways to use technology to make the process of supporting students more efficient. And those so I think of people like Jacqueline Broadbent at Deakin, who was really clever in the way that she used technology to support relationships, not to replace relationships, but to support those relationships. It's not easy to set those things up, but once you do have them set up, and they can work really, really well for that purpose. So that would be the other thing that I think is important there.
Great, lovely. Thanks so much. Now Jan is next with her hand up.
Thanks, Jason. That actually leads into my point, the question I was going to raise, and it was really thinking about how we can actually be using generative AI in much more positive ways, recognizing there are challenges, and we have to think about the ethical side of things constantly. But I was struck when I was at a session in another university, and one of the students made a comment saying the most human experience she had at university was an interaction with a chatbot. And I think that's really interesting. I know that could be read as a criticism, but she was actually super positive about it. And I noticed that Simon's made some comments about that as well. And I think in the chat around the kind of the way conversational agents will increasingly stimulate emotional intelligence in their discourse. I just think it's an interesting thing for us to think about, in that notion of thinking about from transactional to more relational relationships with generative AI.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. That's something we're trying to look at the moment. There seems, so the students that we've talked to about this, there is a decision point at some way through the process where they're quite happy to interact with generative AI to a point, but then there becomes this tipping point where it becomes weird and they kind of enter the uncanny valley, and then they want to go to a human. And for our students, the human interaction, again, even though we're a campus-focused institution, was happening via Instagram Messenger. So there's a tipping point somewhere where they're saying, oh, I'm quite liking the explanations and the way that I'm interacting with this machine. Oh, I'm not comfortable. I want to go to a human, which has been really interesting to see. If there's something about that kind of transition there that's interesting that we're going to keep trying to dig into and find out about. But there's absolutely a place for the AI as part of that support equation, definitely.
Great, fantastic. Sam, your question to Jason?
Hi, Jason. I just have a bit of a question around the time management, study skills, learning how to learn side of your presentation. I found there's always been a bit of a contradiction that students aren't generally keen to spend time learning these types of skills, especially when they really need to learn these skills. And I've run sessions in the past full of HD students who are very happy to be there, but really don't need to know about it because they've been taught it in the past. Whereas the students I hoped would show up are nowhere to be seen in many different types of contexts. So I'm wondering if you've got any insights into how do we get the right students to show up without, punitive types of approaches being utilized, and how do we incorporate that into programs in a way that is accepted by the students without it seeming like we're teaching at a lower level than they would normally be expected to have.
Yep. Thanks, Sam. Great question. I have seen this work really well in the past, but the only way that worked was that it was a kind of institution-wide way of doing it. And what they did there, which was really clever, and for anybody who knows, this was Alf Lizio and Keithia Wilson's work at Griffith a bit over a decade ago. And the idea was that the whole thing was normalized all the way through. So essentially, first contact that student has with the university as part of the admission process, messages about their learning and the importance of their learning started to permeate all the way through. They permeated all the way through O week and then onward into the start of the semester. And by doing that, you're kind of normalizing those conversations about learning. Whereas if you think about it, and I can pick on my own institution here, we're guilty of this. A lot of the communication that we have with students is not about them and their learning, it's about us. It's about our administrative processes, our census dates, our enrollment process. So flipping that over, yes, you still need to communicate all of those things, otherwise students don't get enrolled, right? That's got to happen. But I think if the communication is about learning and students first, and all of the administrative stuff that has to be in there, it has to happen second, I think then you see a different mentality about the importance of those kinds of programs. But that's the one that I'm most familiar with that made a real difference, is that those messages were communicated all the way through. Ideally, what would be great is if the same messages were being communicated from year 7 or 8, right? But the best that we can do as institutions is think about the communication that we have with students, and can we make that communication more about them and their learning and less about us? That seems to make a huge difference.
Thank you. Absolutely. Now, your question, David?
So can I just stop? I might put the Menti up that people can fill in while they're answering questions. Janet, if you would put that up, please. It's just I'm going to ask and see where you've see if you've rethought some of those concepts. So, yes, so over to you, Janet, to Melinda.
Sorry, my screen's changed. Was it David? Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. You mentioned it was a pretty clear message that the building relationships, allowing students to build relationships with their peers and with their tutors is super important. It's critical, and it's kind of matching my feelings lately. Is that it's not good for the ego, but as a lecturer and a coordinator of a large subjects, the understanding that what happens in the tutorials and the labs is much more important than what I do in the lectures. And as subjects get larger, that's more, we have to delegate those labs to other people, to tutors. So it's the area of my subject that I have the least control over. And it's also like we have to be wary of the burden we put on these tutors because they're casually employed. They're pretty new to teaching, and there's not a lot of subject like skill development time that they've got available. So do you have recommendations for coordinators for helping tutors build relationships and help peers build relationships, or do you have recommendations for institutions to enable tutors to do that better?
Great question, David. I mean, part of that's about the tutor training and giving tutors, and let's face it, sessional and casual stuff, enough time to be able to do the kind of development that they need to do. But it comes back to Amanda's point about money then, right?
Yeah.
So within those constraints, I can tell you what I did that worked for me. It's not going to work for everybody, but it might give you some ideas about things that you could try. I got rid of lectures and tutorials. I did all of the kind of content delivery material via video. I figured, you know, students weren't going to turn up to lectures anyway. So I just gave up that idea. And I have all of my students in the room together, all 250 of them. And then I also have 2 demonstrators who work with me. So we kind of do the 2 of them rolled into one. But what that allows me to do by having sort of part me talking through things, but then quite a lot of the activity going, is that we separate the room into quadrants, and then we make sure that we're working across those quadrants so that we all get time with the students, you know, in these small table groups working through different activities. And it seems to work. It took a while to get that tuned right, but I think the point is you can kind of mess with the model a little bit to try and get that interaction happening in different ways. I think what's important is it's what's authentic to you and what allows you to have that kind of relationship happen. That large workshop format works for us, but it's not necessarily going to work in other contexts. So you would need to think about rearranging that somehow. But I think, again, Jacqueline Broadbent and other people like that who have done the work with really massive cohorts where there is a huge teaching team to work with, it's worth having a look at some of that work, because I think the critical piece there was using the technology in a smart way to help foster those relationships with the students, so that the pressure is not all on the tutors. That way, you're kind of taking some of that pressure off by allowing the technology to do some of the relationship building work. But I think ultimately it's probably about having a range of different options and then figuring out what's going to work best in your context.
Sure. Thank you.
Great, thanks. We've got 2 more, Jason. Just hang in there.
Yeah, sure.
And then,
yeah, g'day. Thanks for that presentation. I'm really curious to hear what your thoughts are about. I had actually a relative who recently dropped out of UTS, having done a few years, and it was an interesting discussion. And probably one of the more intelligent family members I've come across in my sort of experience. And one of the reasons they cited was, well, I work part-time at the moment. My supervisor doesn't have any university qualifications. They just have a TAFE qualification and, on-the-job training, and they've managed to get high up in the system. So I don't need to finish my degree, was sort of the reason that she cited. So I'm curious to see what your thoughts are around sort of those anecdotal evidence from industry coming out that a lot of managers and, people now rising up through the system are often not university educated.
Oh, good question. It was funny. I was having a conversation with somebody from the health sector a couple of months ago, and they said to me, universities are training graduates for the world as it was 5 years ago, not the world as it's going to be when for the next 30 that they're going to be out there working on. So it's a really difficult problem that I think we find ourselves in as things change more dramatically. But yeah, I think that there is absolutely a trend out there. And you're seeing the requisite for having a degree being removed from all sorts of different industry, entry level positions all over the place. A lot of that's on us. Like I think a lot of that really does come down to us. And part of that, of course, is going to be working closely with industry. And I think across institutions, some are better than others at doing that. But also part of it is resisting, because our job is not just to help students be ready for day one, but to be ready for their whole career. I call it day 3000. So I think there's a very difficult tension there. We don't want to go into just become purely vocational, because, graduates ready for first day. We've also got to think about what their entire career looks like. And part of our job is to help communicate that with our students and prospective students. Having a degree is not just about getting your foot in the door, but it's about setting you up for whatever you might do and whatever you might change later on in the future. But yeah, it's a really difficult problem, isn't it?
I guess one of the things, I was trying to, stick up for UTS here in the process, but I basically said to her, you're running the risk that you're going to be pigeonholed in one job for the rest of your life, and your marketability potentially is compromised. But, it wasn't I couldn't sell it to us. So anyway, thanks, Jason. Appreciate your answer.
Thanks for sure. Kath, we know you've been waiting patiently. Thank you.
Thanks, Melinda. Actually, it's a beautiful segue. Thank you, Ashur. So my question's really around this. You mentioned how students are making choices about work and choices about study. And Ashur's given the example of somebody who made a choice about study who actually left university. And so I wonder, to what extent do we need to move away from that kind of 3-year model and have more flexible kind of options for students? So, for example, we don't magically change the day we graduate, right? And there was a lot of learning and development that went in Ashur's relative there before they left university. So is there a way that we can enable people to leave and reflect that and come back to us later and add more in that lifelong learning approach that we're all advocating so broadly? So I wonder what we need to do to change what we're offering away from that binary.
Oh, great question, Kath. There are some interesting kind of case studies going on at the moment where there are some institutions around Australia that are messing with the model a little bit. I'm thinking particularly Central Queensland University. I don't know if you know that they've kind of got these open, in terms of time span, these open courses. So you sort of enroll in it and you finish it whenever you manage to finish with it. Apparently they needed to create 100 different new census dates in order for that to work, but they've managed to put it in. So I think it's interesting that we're starting to see some alternate models out there. The other thing I think is worth keeping in mind is that although it sat on the shelf for 5 years, the AQF review, I'm pretty sure, did recommend something about this kind of sub-bachelor degree area where there was something that wasn't requiring a whole 3 years, but would be able to package it up in some way. I haven't looked at the review for some time, but I think the foundation is there to be able to try some of these things out. It's really about which institutions might, do what CQU is doing and mess around with it.
Yeah, so previously where I worked, when I looked at time to complete for an online grad cert, it was 2.5 years average.
Yep.
And that was because of the flexibility afforded for people to take leave, fit it around their, work, family, whatever. But the completion rate was still pretty high, around 80%. So, I think that we need to be a little bit more flexible, given that all of those demands are there on students with greater pressures on their life than previous. So.
Yep. Good point, Kath. I guess our data would suggest that if we're going to do that, we've got to also be really careful to make sure that students know what to do with that flexibility and how to navigate it. Yeah.
Great. And one more question from Gordon, and then I'd like to make a comment. Gordon, over to you.
On mute.
Thanks. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that presentation. And I also enjoyed you saying that, university should be hard and challenging, and you don't get an aha moment without feeling uncomfortable first. This comment may be overly influenced by my discipline, which is economics. And there's a full range of going from very hard analytic sort of training to down a full spectrum to casually chatting about things. So, but on this topic of making things hard or easy, we're under enormous pressure to make things easy. There are the student feedback surveys, which are important for promotion. And actually work has been mentioned a few times, and at least for some jobs, one of the features of starting work compared to university, at least in my limited experience, is that in the workplace, the emphasis is on getting things 100% right, but it's often not as intellectually challenging. So as well as having the SFS pressure to make subjects easier, people who want to always make subjects work relevant and more and more like a workplace may in fact be adding pressure to make things simpler rather than doing the really hard analytic stuff where getting a distinction or a H distinction is a real achievement. So there is a lot of pressure. And I just wondered, I mean, this raises fundamental questions, doesn't it, about what a university is for? Is it to teach people hard things that they can't learn just by sitting around with their friends, surfing the web, being in a workplace, or is it something else? I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, great question. Yes, I think that's part of it. I think, I think there was absolutely a tension there, as you recognize. I think one of the issues is that it's really about what do we make hard? Like, it shouldn't be hard to enroll. It shouldn't be hard to figure out what your timetable should look like. It shouldn't be hard to figure out what the assessment task is. But I think a lot of what we've traditionally done, thinking about all of us broadly, is that perhaps we have made those things a little more difficult than they needed to be. What should be hard is the stuff that is germane to the conceptual understanding and thinking that is required to become an economist or whatever it might be. So I think the way to go here is to try and make all the rest of it as straightforward as possible, so there's no sort of uncertainty or unnecessary, cognitive load that needs to be invested on the nuts and bolts of it. Get that out of the way so that the hard work is really the kind of conceptual understanding that you need to develop in order to learn the core outcomes that we're looking for. But yeah, there is always going to be a tension there, because you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, it's student satisfaction matters. It matters in and of itself, but it also matters for the way that we understand teaching quality. And we all grapple with that. I make it hard for my students, given everything that you've heard. I teach a very dense theoretical course. And I say over and over and over again, this is really important that you immerse yourself in the difficulty of understanding this stuff, but I still get a proportion of students saying they hate it.
And as an economist, I'd just like to apologise for the idea that some economists believe which is that you can never be worse off by being given more choices. And I think the enormous complexity facing students about how to manage the university experience is too much choice for a lot of students.
Yeah, good point.
But thank you, everybody, for your great questions. And I've just got one comment to wrap up to pose to Jason. When can we eradicate this language of dropout? It's got such deficit connotations. And what other language can we replace it with? It's much more hopeful.
Yep, good point. That's why I had my disclaimer at the beginning, because it does give those connotations that there's something wrong with the student. It's not about that.
Yeah, so promoting a strengths-based approach, which is very tied into our inclusive strategies, certainly can shift that space.